What if I told you that one of the most shocking sentences in modern royal history never came from a courtroom, but from the court of public opinion? Not a judge, not a jury, no gavel. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, if you scroll through social media right now, you'll see the same explosive claim repeated again and again, that Queen Camilla has been sentenced to 105 years for the death of Princess Diana. Found guilty. Case closed. Justice served. Or so the internet says. Pause for a second. Let that sink in. How does a story like that even begin? And more importantly, why is it exploding now? Because this isn't really about law. It's about memory. It's about grief that never healed. And it's about a night in Paris that refuses to stay buried. For nearly 3 decades, the death of Princess Diana has existed in a strange space between fact and feeling. Official investigations were conducted. Conclusions were reached. Reports were published. And yet, for millions of people around the world, those answers never felt like answers at all. They felt cold, incomplete, unsatisfying. And when justice doesn't feel satisfying, people don't let go. They reinterpret. They revisit. They rewrite. That's where this story begins. Not with a crime scene, not with a verdict, but with a collective emotional wound that never closed. In recent months, something strange happened online. Old interviews resurfaced. Familiar clips were reposted with darker captions. Emotional music was layered over archival footage. And suddenly, the narrative shifted from remembrance to accusation. Words like sentenced, guilty, and convicted began circulating, not as metaphors, but as statements. Numbers were attached. 105 years. A symbolic lifetime. A punishment that felt heavy enough to match the pain people still carry. Ask yourself honestly, why does that number feel so powerful? Because it sounds final. Because it sounds like justice. Because it sounds like closure. But is it? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. When tragedy meets celebrity, the story never really ends. It just changes platforms. Newspapers become timelines. Investigations become TikTok threads. And grief becomes content. So let me ask you something directly. If millions of people believe a verdict exists, does that make it real? And if it isn't real in law, but real in belief, which one actually shapes history? This matters now because we are living in an era where repetition creates reality. Say something often enough, emotionally enough, and loudly enough, and eventually it stops sounding like a theory and starts sounding like a fact. And that's dangerous. Not because questions shouldn't be asked, they should, but because answers invented to soothe pain can end up distorting the truth. Tonight, we are not here to declare guilt. We are here to examine how guilt is constructed. Because before we can talk about who people blame, we need to understand how this so-called sentence was born in the first place. And once you see where it came from, the story takes a turn no one expects. Here's the question no one asks out loud. How can someone be sentenced without ever stepping inside a courtroom? Because that's exactly what happened. There was no trial date, no opening statement, no cross-examination. And yet, if you read the comments, watch the videos, or scroll long enough, you'll notice something unsettling. People don't speak in questions anymore. They speak in conclusions. She was found guilty. They finally sentenced her. Justice caught up. Listen closely to that language. It doesn't sound speculative. It sounds final. This is how the internet creates its own courtroom. It begins quietly. One clip goes viral. Then another. A creator stitches a moment out of context. Someone adds ominous music. A caption appears at the bottom of the screen, written like a headline, not a hypothesis. And suddenly, millions are watching the same emotional narrative unfold, again and again. Repetition does something strange to the human brain. The first time you hear a claim, you question it. The 10th time, you consider it. The 100th time, it feels familiar. And familiarity starts to feel like truth. That's the mechanism behind what many people are now calling a sentence. Not legal, emotional. Think about it. A real trial is slow, boring, procedural. Evidence rules. Timelines matter. Uncertainty is admitted. But an online trial? That's fast, clean, satisfying. It gives people what they've wanted for decades, someone to point to. And Queen Camilla becomes the symbol. Not because of a document, not because of a verdict, but because symbols are easier than complexity. In these online narratives, she isn't treated as a person. She's treated as an answer, a placeholder for unresolved anger, a figure onto which decades of grief can be projected. And that's where the number comes in. 105 years. Ask yourself why that number spread so quickly. Why not 10? Why not life? Because it sounds deliberate, calculated, punitive. It feels like something a judge would say, even though no judge ever did. It's punishment designed for belief, not law. But here's the contradiction most people miss. If this trial is so convincing, why does it rely on edited clips instead of evidence? Why does it thrive on emotion instead of documents? And why does it explode during moments of renewed royal attention, not during actual legal developments? That's when you realize something crucial. This wasn't about proving guilt. It was about creating closure where none ever came. And once that emotional verdict took hold, the story evolved again. Because outrage alone didn't give this narrative its power. Something older, deeper, and far more personal reignited it. And when that resurfaced, the tone shifted from speculation to certainty. But what resurfaced next would push this story into an entirely new phase, and it would catch almost everyone off guard. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. This story didn't come back because of new evidence. It came back because old pain found a new language. Ask yourself this. Why do certain tragedies refuse to stay in the past? Why do they resurface every few years, stronger, angrier, more certain than before? Because memory is not static. It changes with emotion. When Princess Diana died, the world didn't just lose a public figure. It lost a symbol of vulnerability inside a system people already distrusted. She represented kindness trapped inside power. And when her life ended suddenly, the shock didn't resolve into peace. It hardened into suspicion. Over time, official explanations were given. Investigations were closed. Files were archived. But closure isn't something you can file away. So what happens instead? People revisit the past through the lens of the present. Old interviews are replayed, but now with ominous pauses. Photographs are reframed with darker captions. Innocent moments are recut to suggest hidden meaning. And slowly, the story shifts from what happened to what must have happened. That's the key word. Must. In this newer narrative, Queen Camilla isn't discussed as an individual with complexity. She becomes a character in a story already written by grief. A symbol of the life Diana didn't get to live. A convenient focal point for decades of unresolved emotion. And symbols don't get the benefit of doubt. Notice how these narratives are structured. They don't ask questions. They assert connections. They jump over uncertainty. They collapse timelines. They treat coincidence as intention. Why? Because questions are uncomfortable. Answers feel better. There's also something else at work here, something rarely acknowledged. Nostalgia. Diana exists now almost entirely in memory, frozen at her most compassionate, most tragic, most beloved. She never aged. She never disappointed. She never contradicted the image people hold of her. That makes her untouchable. And when one figure becomes untouchable, anyone perceived as standing in contrast becomes vulnerable to blame, whether or not blame is warranted. This is how history gets simplified. One becomes the victim. One becomes the villain. And the messy truth in between disappears. But here's the contradiction that cracks the entire narrative open. If this story were really about facts, it wouldn't need to rely on emotional edits. If it were about justice, it wouldn't depend on viral timing. And if it were about truth, it wouldn't punish complexity. Yet the louder the story gets, the less room there is for nuance. So let me ask you directly. Are people searching for answers? Or are they searching for relief? Because there's a difference. And the moment relief becomes the goal, guilt becomes a tool, not a conclusion. That's when words like found guilty stop being descriptive and start being performative. But the most dangerous shift hadn't happened yet. Because once the language changed, the story crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. And when that final phrase took hold, it transformed belief into something far more powerful. But what that phrase really means, and why it changes everything, is where this story takes its sharpest turn. Here's the moment everything shifted. Not when a new video dropped, not when an old clip resurfaced, but when one word stopped being used metaphorically and started being used literally. Guilty. Think about how heavy that word is. In real life, it carries procedures, standards, evidence, and consequences. It is supposed to be rare, earned, proven. But online, that word began traveling faster than any fact ever could. Guilty became a headline, a caption, a conclusion. And once that happened, the story stopped behaving like a discussion and started behaving like a verdict. Ask yourself this: who gets to decide guilt when there is no trial? The answer is uncomfortable. Everyone does. And no one does. In the age of virality, belief is crowdsourced. If enough people repeat something with conviction, it stops sounding like opinion. It starts sounding like consensus. And consensus, even when wrong, has power. This is where the idea of a sentence makes sense emotionally, even if it makes no sense legally. A sentence is supposed to end a story. It tells us the chaos has been contained, that accountability has been delivered, that we can finally exhale. That's what people wanted. So the internet gave it to them, not through proof, but through performance. Creators began framing their content like court transcripts. Music swelled at the right moments. Pauses were inserted where viewers were meant to feel shock. Clips were presented as if they were evidence, even when they were simply moments frozen out of context. And every time someone clicked, commented, or shared, the illusion strengthened. Here's the contradiction no one wants to confront. If guilt were truly established, it wouldn't need to be declared so loudly. If justice had actually been served, it wouldn't rely on repetition to survive. Real verdicts don't trend. They endure quietly. But this one needed constant reinforcement. Why? Because deep down, people sensed the difference. They felt the emotional satisfaction, but they also felt the instability underneath it. So they repeated it again, and again, and again. Guilty. Sentenced. 105 years. Each repetition wasn't about truth. It was about reassurance. And there's something deeply ironic about that, especially when you remember what Princess Diana represented to so many people. Compassion, empathy, humanity. Yet the modern retelling of her legacy often leaves no room for any of those qualities. Only certainty, only blame, only punishment. So here's the question you have to sit with. When grief demands an answer, and facts don't provide one that feels satisfying, do we create a villain to protect the story we want to believe? Because once a narrative becomes emotionally necessary, challenging it feels like betrayal. And that's when belief hardens into something dangerous. Not because it's loud, but because it feels righteous. And once righteousness takes over, there's one final step that changes everything. The moment when people stop asking whether something is true and start asking why anyone would dare question it. And when that happens, the story doesn't just accuse. It silences. And what came next would reveal just how powerful that silence had become and why undoing it may be impossible. So here we are. No courtroom transcript. No sentencing document. No judge's signature. And yet, in the minds of millions, the verdict feels settled. That's the paradox at the heart of this entire story. Nothing legally changed, but everything emotionally did. When we started, I asked you how someone could be sentenced without a trial. Now you know the answer. It happened slowly, quietly, through repetition, through emotion, through a collective agreement that belief is enough. The internet didn't uncover a new truth. It constructed a new certainty. And certainty is seductive, because certainty feels like relief. For decades, Princess Diana's death has lived in a space that never fully healed. Official explanations existed, but they never soothed the ache. And when pain lingers long enough, it looks for somewhere to land. This time, it landed on a name, a number, and a word that carries enormous weight. Guilty. But here's the question that matters more than any accusation. What happens when we confuse emotional justice with actual truth? Because once that line is crossed, stories stop being examined. They start being protected. Anyone who questions the narrative is treated not as curious, but as hostile. Doubt becomes betrayal. Nuance becomes weakness. And that's when history begins to harden. Princess Diana's legacy deserves care, not weaponization. It deserves remembrance, not reinterpretation designed to punish. And grief deserves honesty, even when honesty doesn't feel satisfying. This doesn't mean people were wrong to feel pain. It means pain doesn't get to rewrite reality. The most unsettling part of all of this isn't that a false sentence spread. It's how easily it felt right, how quickly people accepted it, how comforting it was to believe closure had finally arrived. But closure that's built on belief instead of truth is fragile. It needs constant reinforcement. It needs louder voices, bigger claims, stronger language, and eventually, it collapses under its own weight. So the next time you see a headline that feels too final, too clean, too emotionally perfect, stop for a moment. Ask yourself who benefits from certainty. Ask yourself what's being simplified. And ask yourself what questions you're no longer being encouraged to ask. Because real justice is quiet. Real truth is uncomfortable. And real understanding rarely comes with a neat ending. This story doesn't end with a sentence. It ends with a choice. Do we keep repeating what feels good to believe? Or do we slow down long enough to ask what's actually true? That decision, not any viral verdict, is what will shape how this story is remembered.